What's good, y'all? Welcome back to the Onyx Report, Black Masculinist news for the day or for the night. Apologize for coming on so late. I promised you guys that I would go see this. I told you guys that the other night. I also said that I do hope that you guys will support the show and donate tonight, because this probably took a couple years off my life watching this bullshit. Anyway, support the damn show, please. Like, share, subscribe, join, and donate. But most particularly tonight, donate. And if you could, you can shoot it to me on the Cash App or the PayPal. I need to get a drink, and that would help toward those ends. And I don't even drink. God damn it, this is exhausting on a number of levels. Shout out to AKs and Curtains. Dardar, what's up? Mark, what's going on? Appreciate that sentiment. Aaron, see a few brothers in here. Like I said, it's not going to be, there's going to be spoilers. But I'm not going to go scene for scene. I'm not going to be on here super long unless I just go into a rant and lose track of time, but I don't really plan on it. Mainly because I don't want to, but I think I'm throwing a little bit of a tantrum. Appreciate that support, AKs and Curtains. Thank you. Thanks, Dardar. Donate to the damn channel. Look, I went to the theater, and I saw it. I wanted to catch it. I caught it at 4:00 actually, and I think I just sat in my car and stared forward for a while, because in many respects this is one of a series of movies. Appreciate the support, Douglas, for the Cash App. Thank you. This is one of a series of movies that are very similar, and they've somewhat become predictable. There were, at least, now I took notes. I got about 70 different entries, so I'm writing throughout the film as I'm watching. And I can tell you there were at least 4 or 5 different times where I predicted something, and within the next 5 minutes, it happened. It was not. Mr. Blue Collar, appreciate the support. I'm trying, y'all. I'm really trying. I'm trying to. It's not so much a matter of gathering my thoughts as it is a matter of just navigating this bullshit. But let's start with some of the surrounding information I want to share with you guys, so you guys at least see what's going on. So here's the thing. Oh, okay. Wait a minute. I had to restart that. So just some information that I thought you guys might find useful, or at least mildly interesting, before I dive in and deal with this. So first things first, there is going to be apparently a new Shaka Zulu series, or King Shaka is what they're calling it. It's going to be a Showtime series. Those are some of the people that will be in it. I hope that they will find a way to not be a part of this trend that we've been seeing, these gynocentric films that have been coming out that have just lost all capacity to tell stories that are mildly interesting. So just letting you know, if this is something you're interested in. The original Shaka Zulu I saw as a kid, and the brother who played him, who I actually never saw anywhere else, was fierce and unapologetically masculine. And we'll see if they engage in that. So I just wanted to get that on the table. Shout out to Dardar. Appreciate that. Quick question though, how many dudes did you see in the theater? Oh, okay. Well, let's get that out of the way. I saw about 5 people in the theater, and they were all old white women. Well, that's not true. There was one. She had to be, she had to be in her 40s, but she was there with 2 little kids. So eventually, the kids were running around the theater because there wasn't nobody there, and they were playing and screaming and throwing things. And normally I would, ask a mother to rein that shit in, but it, I didn't care. So, that was the first thing. So there's about 5 people there, but that's not to say anything about the sales over the weekend. I went to see it at 4:00 on a Thursday. You know what I mean? I just wanted to get it out the way. So we'll see how it goes. I can't really say. But I will say, just out the bat, just to get the shit started, um, I'll get my positives out the way, and it won't take but a second. The scenery was absolutely gorgeous. Cinematography in Africa was beautiful. You know, the natural shots, the skylines. Anybody that follows my Facebook page knows that I love natural scenery. So that mess was beautiful. Even the costume designs were well done. Other than that, this was male torture porn. And it's not a surprise to anybody that saw the trailer. I mean, for the most part, you saw what was coming. This is straight up male torture porn. This is a feminist wet dream about being able to do to men what, many a woman wishes she could. You know, I mean, the same logics were in place that we've seen with a lot of these projects. All the women were smarter, better, more capable, and all the men were pretty much idiots. And it was broken up in a couple of different dynamics, which I'll try to delve into, but I'm so freaking drained and tired that I'm just trying to organize my thoughts on the real. What's up, Keeper 100? What's up, Ray? I see you in there. Clutch, what's going on? So so as far as that, the trailers were even interesting. I mean, they had a trailer for a new Whitney Houston movie that they're coming out with. I didn't see Bobby in it, but what's up, Gigi? I don't know how you do a story of Whitney without Bobby in it, so he had to be there. Maybe I just missed it. My question is going to be how they're going to portray him. So we'll see how that goes. But they had a couple of feminist leaning films that they advertised. One LGBT heavy about gay men getting together, I think in New York. The other one was about white women being, kept in this, kind of suburban prison kind of shit, with Florence Pugh in it. It's always funny to me to see, white women complaining about being kept. Like, once you know the history of how, white women participated in the treatment of black folk, I have a hard time feeling sorry for you and your middle class suburban life. But anyway, so the trailers kind of fit what was going to come, but it was for the most part pure torture porn. So that said, I wasn't thrilled. It owed itself to a couple of antecedents, some projects that came before that we've talked about on this show, many of which people are familiar with. So yeah, I just had to throw that in there. That was my sentiment the whole time. This was definitely me. Much of the time I wasn't writing. Obviously, much of it was inspired by the Dora Milaje, right? Which was based on the actual Dahomean Amazons, which is not an historically accurate term, but it communicates what people are going for. Whenever they go to the Dahomean women warriors, that's what they Goji or whatever, this is what they want to see. So we see this popularized and mythologized in the Black Panther. And what you see happening in the Black Panther was a group of women who were supposedly not much more than the King's Guard becomes this whole damn army for the most part. You basically see that in this. I mean, they transported Wakanda and reimagined Dahomey as Wakanda, where outside of a few occasional men working in the background, maybe some soldiers that are really cannon fodder on the field with the Dahomey Amazons, it's virtually, the film just focuses on women and girls. That's it. The men that are there are just kind of the backdrop. They really don't matter, which is interesting because when you actually research the actual history, they never comprised. There was only like said to be 1 to 6,000 of them at a time. They never comprised more than a third of Dahomey's army. And they only came into existence, from what I understand, because of the loss of so many men in war. But they were treated as this special gem that made Dahomey different and special. And they were these unbeatable warriors. And you're not even 2 minutes into the goddamn movie before they're running through men like a hot knife through butter. I mean, they're just slaughtering men left and right. And in the first battle, which takes place at the beginning of the film, they sneak up on a group of men sitting around a fire, and from there, all the men are slaughtered and left for dead, and one Dahomean Amazon gets killed. Right, and then of course you find out they're there to liberate a bunch of women who have been taken. Now, this is an interesting contradiction, since we know that Dahomey was intricately involved in the slave trade, very unapologetically in many respects, and so to have these women somehow become superheroic, anti-enslavement, figures is, but it's acceptable because at the end of the day, they're saving women. And so we'll get to that in a moment. But just so I get this off my plate, so I don't forget to share it with you again, some of the antecedents. So we know that the Dora Milaje are based off of them. And so, you had many women in particular, Black women, I mean, but even white women, and I'll get to that in a moment too, who couldn't wait to see the most masculine depiction of Black women possible, who based their whole identity off of mimicking warrior men, while at the same time spending the whole film talking about how horrible men are. So it was this kind of idea that they wanted to almost replace men. They could be better men than men, which is the trope we see in a lot of these films. They're stronger, better, smarter, the whole deal. They're better men than men. And that seems to be the reoccurring message we get over and over in these films. But a lot of this was also something we saw in Lovecraft Country. And those of you who saw my review of that, I think Gigi was with me on that one. I know BGS was. We kind of went through that, and we saw the same damn thing. Middle-aged Black women, with swords and spears out there fighting Confederate soldiers and shit. It was a lot of that, and you saw a good amount of that here. One thing I will say, well, fuck it, I'll get to that. But anyway, so let me just get this out the way. So there's more of Lovecraft Country. You can kind of see a lot of this was inspired by that, but it even had inspiration from stuff that just came out, right? It was even inspiration from what I think was probably Prey. I mean, there's a point where she wields her weapon with a rope, much like the character from here, and they were probably as oblivious to men, even when men were helping them, as this character from Prey was. So that being said, let's get to some of the crux of it. Now, this is an article, right, that plays a huge role in this, I think, right? So this is the Hollywood Reporter. I ran across this when I was checking out Antonio Moore's kind of video earlier about the Woman King. He's calling for an ADOS boycott of it. I'm not in disagreement at all, but I promised my viewers I would go check it out to give you guys the lowdown on it. So I followed through, and I actually didn't see the video till I came out of the theater anyway. But I'm not, I understand the argument. I don't have a problem with it because there's a lot of other dimensions to it. His focus, of course, has to do with the whole question of slavery and the watering down of slavery, which I agree with. This film definitely participates in that, and they reimagine the Dahomey as these kind of reluctant heroes that fight against the oil, to kind of save slavery. But really, it's not all of Dahomey. It's just the Amazons because they're women, so they are inherently more wise and brilliant. And it's really the men, most particularly the king, that doesn't really kind of follow the impulse that they have to the degree he should. So they go about saving themselves when some of the Dahomean Amazons are captured and about to be sold. But there's so many dimensions to this. So I'll go through it piece at a time. So bear with me. Let's see. So this particular article here deals with the woman who produced and helped write the screenplay for it. And y'all know I broke this story a while ago when the trailer came out. Her name is Maria Bello. That's her there. She's played in a number of different films and projects. Some of you may be more familiar with than I am. History of Violence, Coyote Ugly, Lights Out. She's been in a number of things. And apparently, she just has a love for Africa and Kenya. So she felt like telling this story. So I'll get into that in a second. So this is the producer, and she also wrote the screenplay. This is the actual writer, Dana Stevens, right? So here you have white women that love to imagine masculine, dominant Black women who kill men at every turn, who are wiser, smarter, stronger, quicker, more capable across the board. And this is, in many respects, a white woman's projection onto Black women. And these are some of the things I believe that white women, revere and like about Black women, but they're only going to go so far in terms of replicating it. But they didn't seem to have a problem with using Black women to kind of frame this. And so many want to see themselves as powerful and, domineering that I guess it's quite successful. But, going back to the article, the Woman King producer, Maria Bello, says more stories should be told from Kenya and across Africa. The actress, who has been going to the country since her ER days, talks about her love of the country and launching a food festival there this fall with fiance Dominique Crin. Right? Ever since she was 27 and cast member in ER, Maria Bello has spent a portion of each year in her happy place in Nairobi, Kenya. She's producing and has a story credit by Sony's on Sony's historic epic, The Woman King, set in the Kingdom of Dahomey, present-day Benin, and out September 16th, which is, of course, tomorrow. But anyway, so they ask her questions, and the only part that I really wanted to get at. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I will try to remember to put this in the chat. And if I forget, you can go to the Hollywood Reporter and check it out there. Let me see. Shout out to Dardar. He says, so in other words, it's the white women's myth of Black womanhood. Absolutely. It very much is. Barry, appreciate that support. It very much is white women's appreciation. Tyrone, appreciate that support for pain and suffering. Thank you for that. Shout out to Troy. Shout out to Perry. For the Cash App. It's much appreciated. Clayton, thank you for the Venmo. Yeah, I need it, fellas. I mean, I might actually have to pick up, I don't even think it'll be a brew. I might actually have to pick up something hard tonight, some hard liquor, because this bullshit was just ridiculous. But there's one point that I wanted to address in this article right here that I think you might find interesting and gives you some perspective on what her motivations were, right? So when they asked her what sparked you to produce and develop The Woman King, she says, The Woman King was definitely born of my love of the continent in general. Now, I'm not going to get on the whole African issue. I think Tone actually gave that a good once over. And he even talked about her perception of the continent as a country. And he was right. So you can check that out. He just did a video a few hours ago, and he's absolutely right about her perception of the continent. And we can talk about white women in power who get to take, all of Africa and make it into whatever they want it to be. And, much of the time we're just kind of sifting through what they give us to find any kind of semblance of meaning. But, for certain people who participate in the project, they see it as a female empowerment dynamic. And it brings in this whole misandric element to it that is absolutely ridiculous. But anyway, it says it's based on women's history. Right? A story I found many years ago about this army of women in the 17th century. So what you have happening with white feminists that engage in projects like this, and this is their attempt at participating in intersectional feminism, is to reimagine African women along the same lines as themselves. And part of the reason for this is they believe that women are a sisterhood around the world. And the argument is that for all time and for all places, women are primarily oppressed by men. And therefore, much like kind of this Marxist idea of wherever you find any kind of capitalism, there will naturally be, opposing, kind of socialist force of people who want to control the means of production. You get the same kind of thing with this brand of feminism, this idea that throughout all time, so it's kind of temporal, trans-geographic, wherever women are, whenever women were, they were always oppressed by men. Men were their primary enemies, adversaries. And so the answer is that women everywhere have to pull together and, and really kind of create the sisterhood. And this is one of the methods they use to do that, where white women actually will take other people's history, reframe it in a context that suits their sensibilities as feminists, and then present it out there. And you have participatory, Black women that'll play into this narrative because it allows them to, kind of present this idea of masculine strength. Because feminine and masculine are seen as Western, constructs. And so, African men had no appreciation for femininity. This is just, all over the place. So they reform the shit however they want to. But she says, I was watching Braveheart and I was like, why isn't there a woman's movie like this? So she took a story out of Scotland and was upset that there wasn't a woman version of it. And from there, decided to create one using African people and African women in particular. So when you're watching this story, men are the problem, right? This actually has more to do with white feminists' preoccupation with misandry than it has to do with anything else. And they reframe the history. So whether it's fathers, whether it's love interests, most particularly husbands, men are the problem. Now, the main character that you follow throughout the story, her name is Nawi. She's played by Tuso Mbedu right here. Very pretty young woman. And so she's kind of the every person that you follow through the story to get to know the Dahomey Amazons, and whatnot. And so in that, she's 19. Her parents are trying to marry her off. She doesn't want to get married. So when she shows up at home after kind of getting a hint that this is about to happen, her father introduces her to her new husband, who looks to be a dude in his late 50s, maybe, you know. And he says, I have several different, fields, and you are going to work in them. She kind of says no. He smacks her, and then she pushes him down, and he's all kinds of shocked. And he gets up and walks away in a huff. And the father takes her, to the Dahomey Amazons and basically says she won't listen to anybody. I'll take her. And from there, she trains as a warrior alongside a bunch of the women that they liberated from the Oyo. These are the bad guys. Now, the leader of the Oyo is a general, who's played, his name is Oba. He's played right here by a guy named Jimmy Odukoya. And he's very much reminiscent of the slave tracker in the film Harriet. I don't know if you guys remember that, but they basically created a character. They created a character in Harriet that didn't exist. And this was a black man who was going around slave catching in order to save up money to be with white prostitutes. And he was bragging about it amongst, you know, other white men and didn't get lynched for it. Right. So they fabricated this character that was going around trying to catch slaves and who was trying, and he was, Harriet Tubman's primary, adversary throughout the majority of the film. Oba, the general of the Oyo, is very much kind of like that, right? He's the big bad general. And the Oyo are, from what you can see, mostly men. The only time you really see women with them is when they're capturing women for the sake of enslaving them. Okay. So that said, that there's no empathy there for women at all. And whereas Dahomey, you have usually when you see Dahomey in the film, it's majority women. That's what the camera focuses on. Like I said, there's men in the background doing work. The king is obviously a man. Everybody else is a woman. So it's kind of like this, especially when you go into where the Dahomey and Amazons, live in the special part of the palace that no men can go into. It's this black feminist Shangri-La. And black feminist film productions are preoccupied with this all-female Shangri-La, this all lesbian Shangri-La, where everything is great because men are not there to fuck it up. One of the ways I first discovered this is when I did a review of Self-Made, which was I think it was the next Netflix film we saw on Madam C.J. Walker, and Tiffany Haddish is in it, a number of others. And if you remember at the end of the film, they live in a mansion next door to the Rockefellers, I think it was, and it was all just mother and daughter and friends and girlfriends. It was this female Shangri-La where life was perfect and they had wealth and champagne glasses abound because they didn't have to deal with these niggas that was fucking up their lives. That's kind of what you get here. And so many of these films are preoccupied with men and excluding them because men are the source of all their problems. They do have one gay brother in the film, and he seems acceptable. He hangs with the girls. He works for the king. He's one of the top level servants or whatever. Never see any kind of antipathy from him. There's really no tension with him. The tension is all between women with the one. Well, we assume there are lesbians in the crew. We don't see any engagement between the women, but we kind of assume it's there. And then you got the one gay brother, and so that whole unit has to deal with heterosexual men as the problem. So whether it's the fathers that bring their daughters in, whether it's the other male soldiers who can't wait to find a reason to rape women, or the king himself who has several wives and is trying to figure out which one of them is going to be his woman king. They tolerate the king more than anyone, but for the most part, men are a nuisance. They're a bother. And amongst them, they talk about how you cannot be a member unless you have, basically decided not to have anything to do with men. I mean, that's kind of the dynamic at play. So they brag about not having babies. They're not wives. They are just warrior women for life. Now, I do want to share this little tidbit. I like IMDb, the website. And the website, as a hobby, one of the things I like to do sometimes is I look up movies, and they always have this little trivia button. And if you click the trivia link in the movie on the page on IMDb, they always give you a little bit of trivia that you don't get anywhere else about the film. I wanted to read this first part because I thought it was important. In the film, Naniska, who's Viola Davis, confronts Gezo. Now, this is John Boyega's character. He's the king of the Dahomey. Right? She confronts him about the immorality of selling black slaves to the Portuguese and suggests trading in palm oil production instead. While this conversation is fictional, it is based on the historic fact that the Ogoji, which are the Dahomey Amazons, favored trading palm oil with the Europeans between 1840 to 1870. Whether they considered it immoral is unclear, especially given their history of participating in slave raids. Slavery in Dahomey persisted after the British Empire stopped Dahomey from continuing in the Atlantic slave trade. The British Empire's Royal Navy successfully blockaded Dahomey's slave trading in the 1840s, which led to Dahomey's two political parties becoming polarized, about what to trade. Now, this is interesting because one of the things we talk about, and we've talked about in the Onyx Report, is that when the slave trade was formally kind of shut down, right around the later part of the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century, one of the things the U.S. government decided to do was do one last, kind of pull in of enslaved Africans from the continent, and they fixated on women because the idea that various states had is if we're going to end slavery, we need enough slaves to produce our own populations, and so that's when you started to see massive breeding farms and whatnot. So the last pull of black women coming into North America was really the earliest part of the 19th century. They didn't really get here until like 1810, somewhere around there. You're talking about 50, 60 years before the end of slavery is when you saw the largest population of black women brought in. Prior to that, slavery fixated, at least in North America, on men, or I should say in the Western Hemisphere, mostly fixated on men. And they worked men to death and replaced them with other men. So there was no, we're going to try and, make sure these men live long enough to provide a certain amount of work. No, they worked you to death and they replaced you. Women were sought after more in the Arab slave trade, which took place on the African continent as well. And it's still taking place by many accounts. But in terms of the Western Hemisphere, it was mostly men. So when we see this, where they're talking about the British Empire, kind of having to, blockade Dahomey, it speaks to the investment that Dahomey had in it. So to make this movie about, this super heroic group that tries to stop the slave trade is really in many ways such a slap in the face. And they tried to genderize it to where the women had an empathy for the slaves. And it's really these African, men, whether they were Dahomey or Oyo, and then you had these Portuguese, all of the men across race were the problem. And the women were the ones that had this kind of moral, internal, compass that others didn't have. And they would come in and fight all these different men, to different degrees for different purposes, right? So they're fighting the Oyo because the Oyo is trying to oppress the Dahomey. They're fighting the Portuguese, because they're not trying to, participate in the slave trade. And of course, that includes when women are taken, most particularly other Amazons, right? That's their big investment in it. And of course, they fight the Oyo because, they needed to show that they were superior to black, white, any kind of men possible. And they do. They run through the Oyo like nothing, like absolutely nothing. And so it's hard not to kind of see that dynamic, right? There's a particular point in time where Viola Davis's character, Naniska, kind of figures out that the general of the Oyo is a man that raped her many years before. Now, this is important to a masculinist critique because part and parcel to how black men are conceptualized in these black feminist productions, we are worse than white men. We are worse than the systemic structure of oppression and slavery or whatever it may be in the given story that white men initiate. We're worse because we're black men. We're more oppressive. Black patriarchy is worse than white patriarchy, even though nobody's really established what evidence there was of a black patriarchy. But usually when you ask, it comes down to something very Fences-esque, Denzel Washington-esque. This era where a man went to work and women were expected to clean, even though they also had to work, is somewhere between Mr. and Color Purple to Fences. And there's this time period where these oppressive men are married to women. And then, of course, somebody always brings up domestic violence because that is the pinnacle of black oppression, black patriarchal oppression, because you can't really talk about anything systemic with black men. So that's the best you can do. And then when you go into the data and you kind of show that, a lot of this domestic violence was and is bi-directional. And then they just tell you to shut up, and then they start telling you intimate stories or personal stories of having been abused. Because if you start getting into the data, the shit falls apart, and it's not really appealing. So it doesn't work. So that's kind of how black patriarchy is kind of framed. You know, you get in these conversations with feminists, and you start pressing them against the wall about when and what black patriarchy looks like. They'll talk to you about domestic violence, and they'll talk to you about having to cook and clean. That's black patriarchy. While the men, by the way, were sipping mint juleps on the porch. I mean, it's not like they were out there working, or dying. None of that actually happened. I mean, they were just enjoying life, and they had black women as slaves. We're not even going to get into the minutia of what took place during during the sharecropping era. But I digress. Let's get back to this. So these women form a bond. They form a family amongst themselves of all black women. And once you become, Igoje, once you become an Amazon, you're a part of their family, and you're received no matter where you came from. And of course, you had to go through an initiation. Now, I will say this. Some of these feminist films are starting to finally grow up a little, in the sense that usually what you had a number of years ago, and we marked this mostly with something like Star Wars, you had a Rey kind of character who was a Mary Sue. Man, before she even knew what a lightsaber was, she was killing off, Sith lords. This time, they're starting to listen, and so they put the primary character Naui, who's 19, through this hero's journey. So they're starting to see, okay, in order to tell better stories, we can't just have a Mary Sue that knows everything from the gate. She's kind of hard-headed. She's kind of an asshole at different points in time. And so even the other Amazons kind of have to check her, and they kind of giggle behind her back because they like her hard-headedness. They like her strength, even though she's young and impetuous, so they have to kind of guide her and whatnot. But you see her grow. You see her grow as a fighter, a warrior. You see her grow as a person, So they're starting to experiment with the hero's journey a little bit more, as opposed to stories where women are just perfect from the beginning, the middle, and the end. There's still a little bit of that, though. Right? The women are just better at everything, but at least you see them training. So they didn't just wake up, pick up a sword, and know everything about it. But they still cut through men like men are nothing. It's just it is what it is. It's ridiculous. But you are starting to see a little more development, but there's still this deep investment in this Shangri-La idea that is really a white feminist production, that all women really won't find their happiness until they bond with each other and, basically, absolve themselves of men. And this is something that I've definitely seen even amongst African American women. There's this idea, and they talk about it in the film at one point, where they tell Naui, one of the elder women, one of the elder women in the Amazon, she says, look, you can't be with men if you're going to be with us. You'll lose your power. And they start talking about love. And the idea is that if you love a man, you lose your power. And by not loving a man and banding with your sisters, you keep your power. Now, this is interesting because I've actually met women in my lifetime that have said those very words. So how much of that is a Dahomian tradition and how much of that is brought to the movie? I tend to lean toward the latter, but that is what it is. So there's this belief that love weakens you as a woman. You're forced to be feminine and ergo weak. And the idea of strength is a masculine one. And these women emulate or seek to emulate masculinity, while at the same time, you get the idea that they're trying to just be something different, right? They don't want to be traditional women. They seem to hate men, and so you have this push to be something different. But what they actually seem to be is an attempt at emulating warrior men at every turn while beating warrior men on a regular basis. Make that shit make sense. Yeah, there's no discussion really at all that the fact that they exist is because so many died that they were necessary. There's no discussion about that. They just always were. So you have that. So they are starting to improve the stories a little bit, but the failure of feminist productions is that the hatred and misandry toward men is so deeply embedded that you never quite escape it. And you can't rationalize relationships between men and women if men have to remain this misandrous, kind of idea of being oppressor patriarchs whose only reason for being is raping and beating women. That's it. Now, they do have one character who damn near worships Naui. And he is for lack of a better term, He's the representation of black men in the diaspora. He's a Brazilian. He's half Brazilian, half Dahomey. And his mother was a Dahomean. She was an enslaved Dahomean, and she dies. And her dying wish is that her son go see her home. So, having been raised in Brazil and with the Portuguese, he comes with a Portuguese slave trader who's the captain of his own slave ship to visit Dahomey, and instantly kind of falls in love with Naui, whose first impulse is to pull a weapon on him as soon as she meets him. And of course, he has to be swimming in a lake, and he comes out the lake naked, and she has his clothes plus a sword. So clearly, there's a dominant kind of stance she takes. And really, the rest of the movie, he's just kind of finding ways to earn her favor by serving her. You know, they don't have sex, they don't kiss. He just goes out of his way to prove he can be a good guy. So he's rather confused as far as his loyalties between the Portuguese and the Dahomey. He gets now into a little bit of trouble trying to talk to her, even though she's not supposed to associate with men. And he ends up tipping off Dahomey to an attack by the Oyo. And so they're able to preempt the attack because of that. But he's still not allowed to be with her. And it does get to a point at the latter end of the film where he literally buys her once she's captured in war and about to be sold into slavery. She tries to initiate a revolt amongst those who've been captured. It fails. And then, of course, you have Viola Davis' character finally being invited to sit on the throne. This is toward the latter end of the movie, next to the king. And she decides to disobey the king to go liberate those women who were captured in war. And by doing so, she hooks up with Naui, and they go from there. Now that so you have this half British dude, and some of you saw a picture a few months ago of an Amazon kissing what looked to be a white soldier. And BGS and I were saying, no, that's not a white soldier. The hair from his beard was not white hair, and we were right. He was mixed, right? So he kind of represents black men in the diaspora. He has this love for her, but really, what you find in a lot of these films, and they end the same kind of way. She likes him, but she's not going to give up her strength. So she leaves with her sisters, and she gives him a little nod as she leaves. He gives a little nod, and that's the end of that, right? Because you can't actually have them be together. And again, heterosexual men are fundamentally the problem. He is kind of a problem. He gets her in trouble a few times, but he means well, right? And he helps her at cost of his own social status. So he's a good guy, but he doesn't get the girl. So you don't get the girl in feminist films, right? You may get killed, but you don't get the girl. So there's a lot of this shit going on. Let me see. Let me back up again. Appreciate the support, Flow Hypnotic. Thank you. Elia, good to see you in here, man. Appreciate the support. Appreciate your contributions last night. Sir Shy, just wait till Black Panther 2. Yeah, this is like Black Panther 1.5. This is like Black Panther 1.5. And Black Panther 2 is probably going to be worse. I heard they started doing, Dardar says, so in other words, so they started doing reshoots on Black Panther, and I'm one to believe that they're doing it because there's been so much blowback early on. I personally do believe that's played a role in this, and I think it's happening across the board. I think even Stacey Abrams has done some reshoots of her own because of that, and I think a lot of that pushback came from us. And I'll be doing a show about that later. But anyway, so that's another part of it. Let me see. So they pay lip service to ending slavery, even though none of that seems to be historically accurate. They try, and I think they tried to do it to kind of fix the obvious political issues with choosing to tell this story, but it's really ham-handed. It's really weak. It's a couple of verbal statements about maybe we should end slavery, and then there's a little slave uprising, but it really had little to do with those who were being enslaved and more to do with the Amazons themselves. So they don't even really fixate on where the other Africans came from, where they were going to. They're just kind of backdrop, especially if they're male. They're just kind of in the backdrop. The Brazilian captain is said to be, a king. A friend of the king. And he's coming to buy slaves, and they kind of have an okay relationship. They've known each other for a while. It's amicable, and it's kind of left at that. But the larger politics are really kind of left out. The Oyo are the troublesome niggas, and they have to be killed. And they are. So when you actually see the big war with the Oyo from the Dahomey, the majority of the army looks like it's women, and they're fighting against the majority male army of the Oyo, and they pretty much slaughter them. They outsmart them. They beat them in hand-to-hand combat at every turn. They kind of take them out, and eventually you get to see Viola Davis fight the big bad Oyo general, who, by the way, had raped her when she was younger, so she can't wait to get revenge. And what you actually end up seeing happen, they fight twice, and they don't have her just beat him outright. He gets a few shots in, even though he's like, 2, 3 times her size. Um, but she eventually ends up killing him when he stabs her through her forearm. She turns the blade around and stabs him in the chest while the blade is still through her forearm. In another instance, one of the senior Amazon's arm is broken. Now, here's the thing: it's broken halfway between the shoulder and the elbow, just halfway down the arm. It's broken. She actually has one of her friends push the bone back in, and then she gets into a big fight and kills a bunch of soldiers. It's just fucking. I'm sorry. Um, I'm not as professional as I try to be. I'm exhausted, so I'm trying to keep my cool. But there's just moments where it was like, "Are you serious?" Anyway, um, I mean, it's not like a break where you dislocate your shoulder and you put it back in the socket. It's a clean break halfway through the arm, and she's fighting soldiers in the next scene right after the bone is pushed back in. That bone is pushed in, but if you start running, that arm is flailing around and that bone is just wiggling. It isn't anyway. So there's a little bit of that going on. There's a particular point where there's a question as to whether the king is going to actually marry Viola. Now, mind you, John Boyega is playing a character that's about his real life age. He's a fairly young king, and it's said that he's a traditionalist who wants to follow the old laws where it's a masculine and feminine representation on the throne, based on how they conceptualize the deities, right? Most of them seem to practice Ifa. They're into the Orishas. And so he wants to emulate that. And he has to choose which woman he wants there. And you have some of the other women who are vying for power, vying to marry him. And of course, Viola Davis is indifferent to him. I mean, she sees him strictly in terms of his political role and the role she plays as general of the Amazons. So all these other women are vying for his attention, his affections. They're vying to marry him, and she just kind of tolerates him. And of course, she's the one he chooses as a wife. And then the first thing she does is disobey him and go get her daughter out of being captured. She comes back with a bunch of captured folk, and the crowd, cheers for her, and he makes her Woman King. So, I mean, it is what it is as far as that's concerned. But let me see. There's so many different things. I'm trying to skip through this so I don't walk you through a 3-hour breakdown of each scene, because I don't want to do that to you or myself. But I will say they do overestimate the impact of the Amazons, much like they do in Black Panther. They do. They make them the primary military force. They make them elite. They make them unbeatable, when we know that by the time, the historical record, catches up, when you talk about what the French, their engagement with the French, it was pretty much a slaughter, which nobody wants to see. And the film supports that because they don't show it. The only time you see them in battle is when they're pretty much invincible. There's only a couple of them that die, and it's a big deal. But it's very much like an African Woman's 300. So even though the producer was thinking of Braveheart, what she actually ended up making was 300. And the king and Viola Davis's Naniska are the same for the most part. There's even a point where she pretty much expects to die at a certain point. It's very reminiscent in certain respects. So you kind of have that. Shout out to Officer Faulkner. What's good with you, man? Appreciate the support. He says those Amazons had over 400, losses compared to the European forces, who only lost 6. Oh yeah, 6 soldiers. Right. That's pretty much what you saw. That's pretty much what you saw. Um, you know, it was pretty much like that. There was such a need to see Black women as strong, but nobody questioned the definition of strength. So it ended up becoming a poor, imitation of men. It's almost like a stereotype of men. It's like one of the things I see when I see Butch Dykes. One of the things I notice is they tend to emulate almost like a rap video version of a black male. It's and I see this in films too. It's almost like they stereotype men and then they try to emulate the stereotype. And if they emulate the stereotype well enough, then they're better men than you are. But the complexity of what it means to be a man is lost in these films and often in the way, feminists, imagine men and manhood. That's why you're starting to see a rash of films by men, usually top Hollywood elite, that are starting to come out where they're showing that men have always had dimensions to them. I was talking to BGS about this earlier. So I mentioned movies like Maverick, right? Even movies like Father Stew. Hell, you can go to Denzel Washington and Antoine Fuqua's the Equalizer, where you're starting to see masculine male heroes coming back out who are unapologetically male, but they don't follow the line of the stereotypical oppressive idea, which was never entirely accurate. Men are as multidimensional as any other human being. They can be sacrificial, they can be loving, supportive. We play every role in the in human expression, but somehow the way we're stereotyped is only as monsters that only live to hurt women. And so this depiction, when it causes frustration for men, that's considered part of the oppression. Whereas the dehumanization of men and how we're represented, most particularly again, heterosexual men, is not considered par for the course, not considered part of the discourse, right? So let me see. Anything in this that I think is important enough to say that I haven't said already? Let's see. This I covered. Now they did call them the King's Guard, much like the Dora Milaje. But again, somehow the King's Guard becomes the primary army, and nobody, whether it's in Black Panther or in Woman King, wants to explain that, because at the end of the day, you know what they did to create Wakanda is to pull a mythic superheroic version of the homie into Marvel. And then, in order to make this movie, it looks like they went to Marvel and pulled that version back and projected it back into the 17th century to make the Woman King. So at any point, I was waiting for T'Challa to jump the fuck out with a vibranium spear or something. But anyway, it didn't happen. But he didn't need him there, I guess, because he had Viola Davis, whatever. So let's see. They are to take no husband and bear no children while they live in the palace as warriors. And then it said that they will experience no harm for the sins of their men. I deal with misandry on a day-to-day basis, and a lot of what I read, a lot of what I research, a lot of what I hear. And because most people don't know what that word means, it's invisible to a lot of them. But when you understand what it means and how it presents, you start to see it a lot. And it's exhausting in many respects. The misandry was rampant in the film because, again, it's justified, right? Because the men are all big bad slavers and oppressors. So whatever misandry you see is considered justifiable. But it really has more to do with white women's preoccupation with their hatred of men, their hatred of white men, most particularly. And we've heard about this since the 1960s. Their idea is to court other groups of women around the world to take the same position they have. But the funny part, I saw this in a meme a few weeks ago, and it was true. It said white women were more concerned with getting more of what white men had. Black women were more concerned with not needing black men. And I can actually say these kind of films definitely drive that very point home. Much of the film was, I don't need you as men. And it very much complements more of a Western take on where women have articulated themselves to be, at least as far as popular media is concerned. And I don't know how much of that actually has to do with the homie. I think the homie just becomes kind of a tabula rasa, like a blank slate that they kind of project the current moment and the current set of politics, most particularly gender politics, onto. and tell the same story that we've seen in 1,000 other movies in the last 20 years that, um, you know, boys and men are just worth it. So you end up with Cynthia G's notion of aborting black male children and that being some kind of social good. Because as long as you drive home this idea that men are monsters and men are the animals, even when the data shows as far as abuse and even intimate partner homicide, the rates are actually very similar. I will be doing a show to talk a little bit more about this. I talk about it often on my channel, but people seem to forget it. So I will be delving back into it to show you some of the more recent cases where this thing is still happening. And if anything, one can say that this is likely increasing in the midst of the pandemic and the post-pandemic moment, where you're seeing people fraying at the edges and breaking down at the pressure and stress of a failing economy. And the question of not needing men is starting to bite people in the ass, because as much as you may not want to deal with somebody, the realities of needing someone is a very different thing. And if you've been trained to not see men as a necessity, and then you end up living in a context where the math doesn't work as far as meeting your needs, you don't know how to deal with it. You've not been socialized to. You've been socialized to see men as a problem, not as part of what's supposed to be your everyday life. That becomes a bit of a problem. And there's been, multiple generations raised up on that idea, men and women, that men aren't necessary in women's lives. Now, the consequence of that is, on one end, yes, you have a lot of what we might call, American Amazons that believe that men aren't necessary. But what you're also starting to see is a lot of men who are saying, okay, and stepping back. We've talked about this. You got young boys that are not, competing for women's interests, playing video games. Some people call it lying flat, particularly in Asia. Grass eaters, whatever. There is that sentiment here. And then now you have this latest iteration with Passport Brothers, which isn't new, but it's gaining popularity because men have said, okay, we've heard you. Since the 1980s, niggas ain't shit. Got it. We understand. You don't want us. You don't respect us. You're not going to respect us. Even when we are like Malik, the Portuguese Brazilian character who serves now, we all throughout the film at every turn, doesn't even try to kiss her, even though you could tell he's enraptured by her. Still doesn't matter. At the end of the movie, she tips her head to him, but she leaves with her girls, maintains her power, right? Because it wouldn't be natural for men and women to actually be together. So, but yeah, so men have heard this. Men are like, okay, it took a few generations, but men are getting like, I get it. You don't, right? You don't value us. You don't want us. We're disposable. We get it. We ain't shit. You don't like us. Right. We've heard this. We've seen it in movies, television shows. We've heard it in music. We get it. You make enough money. You don't need us. We get it. Except the data suggests that there are fewer women, particularly in the Black community, but this is pretty much universal, that make this, fantastical six-figure line that's supposed to mark stability, which I don't know what the fuck that means in 2022, but people still hold to it. There are fewer women that make that than men. And despite what we see on TV, or despite what you may see in a restaurant in Atlanta, New York, San Francisco, or LA, majority of women are struggling. Black women in particular now are the most evicted group. And Black men aren't doing any better. They just didn't count how many of us were homeless in the first place. The only difference is men accept it as a way of life. Women have been told that they're magical. And what did Hope say in that discussion with Umar? They throw their struggle and trauma in the air and turns into magic, right? This shit is crazy. It's crazy. I do believe it's been orchestrated, but at the end of the day, you still can't work with someone that doesn't see you as human. So where do you go with that? You have some of the broken women that become Amazons because their motivation is that they can be hunters and they can be strong, man-like once they become the Homians, or Amazons, I should say. They played this in the trailer. There's a moment where one of the male and when the Amazon soldiers stand and they have a spear dug into each one's shoulder. It's straight, they're facing each other. It's one spear connecting the two of them, and it's in both their shoulders. And whoever can push the other and withstand the pain the longest is, of course, the victor. And of course, she wins. The male soldier quits, and then the women dance and kind of, flip off the men like we're stronger than you. And it's just a recurring set of these kinds of scenes of female dominance. It's like, okay, you get to a point where I won't say that anyway. Let's see. Is there anything else I want to cover in this shit? Because I'm not doing this again. Well, I am supposed to be on a show tomorrow where they've asked me to talk about it, but I'm not planning to do this after that. So I'm just trying to see if there's anything else I want to cover. There's a lot, but I'm starting to actually feel sick. So what I would say overall, I think, is that if you're into misandric porn, if you're into male torture porn, this is the film for you. And there are plenty of such films. Only costs about $50 million to make, so if they can get enough women to support it, they might make their money back. By Hollywood standards, that's not a lot. But if you're not into male torture porn, that might be a problem. And when you're living in a culture where male torture porn is considered cutting edge gender theory, so to speak, I'm being a little facetious, but I'm not. I don't know if we're ready for the repercussions of that. But hey, it's on us anyway. So we'll see what happens. So King Vegeta says, if you meet a woman who wants to be glorifies or celebrates the Dahomey warrior, run fast and hard. Yeah, pretty much. Charles says, how did the movie frame black men in general? That's the thing, right? So Western hemisphere, hemispheric black men are kind of represented through the one character. And he's a good man because he's willing to listen and serve the woman he loves, but he's not rewarded with any affection or love back. Really, he just serves to be serving. The rest of the men are either Oyo, Dahomey, or European, right? They're Portuguese. All of them are a problem. The Dahomey are less so because they are willing to acknowledge the women's value. So the Amazons, they tolerate Dahomean men, but the Oyo have to be killed outright because they're just oppressors. And of course, the Portuguese. So there is a whole portion of the film where you see them slaughtering Portuguese. I'm not really opposed to that. I get it. It's very much like Jamie Foxx and Django. It's this moment where the Africans get revenge. So I'm not going to rail against that by any measure. But when you do see a woman that's like 100 pounds, kill off 4 soldiers, it was very much the same reaction I had when I saw the same thing happening, where it was a middle-aged woman killing a bunch of soldiers in Lovecraft Country, right? This middle-aged black woman who somehow gets projected back to the Dahomey Amazons, and then she's killing Civil War soldiers left and right. You just kind of go, and in some ways, it's almost a slap in the face to black men because we actually went to war. And the idea that's kind of subtly communicated in these various scenes across Lovecraft Country, Black Panther, and the Woman King is that, if women could have done it, they'd have done it better. They'd have done it easier. They'd have done it more smarter. They'd have done it with more capability. They'd have survived in greater numbers. It's this kind of subtext that, in one sense, is a slap in the face to black men that actually did fight these battles, whether they be Africans on the continent or whether they be brothers in America dealing with the realities of being here. There's a point where this kind of fantastical misandry slaps the black men in history and in the face. Again, black men ain't shit takes on a whole nother dimension when you replace them with black women who take out black, African and European men with no difficulty. They just do it because they're inherently better creatures. And you just start to wonder, okay, how many films are you going to do like this? And should we care? I would not suggest going to see this movie. If anything, if you really need to see it, if I wasn't going to see it for y'all, I might have watched it when it came on HBO or some shit, but I don't know. Short of that, I'm doing this so you can make your own choice. But I got a feeling that the brothers that I deal with in this space are not really, kicking down doors to go see it. Shout out to Fear to None. Appreciate that support. But this is what we're dealing with. Let's see. Part of the Dahomey War cry literally included the phrase, "I am not a woman, I am a man." Yeah, yeah, yeah. There was a lot of that. But that's the thing. Even though that was recorded as being said at one point in time in the film, you don't see that because that would give too much credit to men. They don't want to do that. So the idea is that they're emulating warrior men, but they don't outwardly say they're men. They actually, which is what was recorded in terms of the Dahomey women actually saying that they were men. In this film, it's this a bit of this kind of feminist confusion where they're emulating men, but they hate men, so they're not trying to be like men, but they are trying to be like men. Yeah, so there is a little bit of um, that kind of confusion at play. Trying to look through the comments, see if I'm missing anything. Um, anyway, that's all I can really do. Like I said, I didn't want to even be up here this long. I'm surprised it took this long, but at the end of the day, it was exactly what you thought it was. I'll put it to you that way. Officer Faulkner says, "I'm a soldier. I haven't seen any women challenging the male soldiers to fight in order to battle the enemy in Iraq." And the irony with that, Charles, is this is probably the best era for women to fight in. If you talk about drone warrior, drone pilots, that kind of thing, this might be the only era in human history where you could have a large number of women participate and it not, be just a complete wreck. But when you start talking about hand-to-hand combat, it's a fucking mess, and nobody wants to acknowledge the realities of that. But when you project this same attitude that's a product of contemporary technology into the 17th century, it's like so all of a sudden they're the majority of the Dahomean army and they're slicing through other. And it wasn't even just the oil by themselves. They went and got other groups. So their army was comprised of multiple armies and they just get cut through like nothing. So anyway, and so AK says, don't watch End of the Road with Queen Latifah. She took out about 4 to 6 grown men. Oh my God, man. I am completely convinced when the youngest generation gets into cross-gendered fights and the men, especially after, when you get out of after puberty, right? And you see these men just cutting through these women and people don't understand why it's happening. I'm really led to believe that a lot of this is happening because you've had a couple of generations raised with the belief that there are no significant differences. One can have babies, one injects sperm. That's the best you can do. There's really no other differences that you can talk about. That's it. Everybody is everybody in it. But if anything, women are more inherently pure. They're better. They're more intelligent. They're more capable. It's just. I had an argument with a guy on my Facebook page this morning about that. He was like, "Women are just better." And I'm like, "Okay, dude, you can carry that if you want to, but in the Black community, it's not about being better. What it is about is they've had several decades of support. They've actually been socialized to operate in a way that's different, even as far as just a base level assumption that they're able to gain traction in society through participating in the current structures, whether it be voting, whether it be securing grants and participating, setting up businesses. Even though Black men have more businesses, they tend to operate in such fashion where they know they're going to find support, whether it be state or governmental, federal government, whether it be philanthropic, whether it be corporate. They operate with a little more assurance that there will be support because they get it. Black men often don't. We usually, our whole framework, our whole business model is often predicated on pulling it out of the mud because for the most part, that's the only option we've ever really had. This is why I had brothers coming to me in 2020 talking about when they were applying for PPP loans, they had to find women to be the face of their organizations, sisters, wives, girlfriends. Hell, some of them just paid women to sign a sheet of paper to say they were the face of the organization just to get the kind of loans that these brothers knew they wouldn't get otherwise. And many didn't. And I still have women that don't believe that there's a difference in that. I still have, friends and associates. I should actually say associates that have tried to get me to apply for projects that they get and I don't. And I'm twice as qualified as they, but it doesn't work that way. And men understand it. Women, however, live a different reality. And that reality is different because there is a backing. that men have never had. That's the reality of it. So I know I missed quite a bit, but check it out. I would honestly tell you, you're not missing much. Watch the shit when it comes on cable or whatever. You know, some people will bootleg it if you feel the need. Others may watch it a decade from now. I wouldn't lose any sleep either way. But all I will say is, you know, there are a couple of story elements that are mildly amusing, but for the most part, everything that happened, I either knew it was going to happen before I got to the theater, and the 4 or 5 things that I predicted 5 minutes before they happened. I didn't really find this to be groundbreaking, but what I did find is a heavy dose of, you know, men are disposable, if not problematic oppressors. And if that's your bag, then you probably enjoy the story. Anyway, I'm gonna check out. Like I said, I'm going to get a fucking drink. I haven't checked the cash apps, but I really hope y'all contributed because I don't exactly have any liquor in the house. But I'm about to look real questionable because I might just show up at the local liquor store in my drawers. I don't even feel like putting pants on. I just need a drink. Damn it. It's really one of them nights. Anyway, y'all have a good one. Appreciate the support. Peace. I'll listen for you in the comments. Let me know if there's anything else you want to discuss. Again, this is obviously filled with spoilers, so the comments will be as well. If you want to ask me any questions, I'm down. But y'all have a good one. I am here to tell you, brothers, we are not criminals by birth, perennial rapists, incapable intellects, man-children, sperm donors, child support wellsprings, success objects, walking phalluses, ATM machines, lottery tickets, unintelligent henchmen, valueless assassins, pro bono mercenaries, unpaid bodyguards, interchangeable stepfathers, child discipline proxies, unpaid repairmen, workhorses, emotional tampons, or any other socially accepted dehumanizing stereotype. We are thinkers, inventors, innovators, leaders, fathers, and men. Embrace your humanity, know your worth, and extend your time, attention, and resources only to those who genuinely respect you. And remember, your worth is not defined by meeting other people's narcissistic and selfish and unrealistic needs. You define your worth. Peace.